Welcome back, everybody. Today we're going to be taking a deep dive into one of those books that, it's considered like a classic, and it's one of those that, you kind of feel like you should have read, but maybe haven't quite gotten around to it.
Hmm. I know that feeling.
Yeah. Well, I'm talking about 1984, George Orwell's 1984, a pretty bleak look at a future that thankfully hasn't quite come to pass. I mean, not yet, anyway.
Good yet.
But a lot of what Orwell wrote about feels eerily relevant even today, with all the talk about surveillance and censorship and, the whole like truth is relative thing. It's like we're living in some kind of weird echo of that world.
Oh, absolutely. And that's what makes 1984 so fascinating and so disturbing at the same time. It holds up a mirror to our own society and forces us to ask some uncomfortable questions about, the direction we're headed in.
For sure, for sure. So for this deep dive, our listeners sent in some really thought-provoking excerpts from the book, and we're going to use those as jumping off points to kind of explore the key themes and ideas in Orwell's work.
Sounds like a plan.
All right, so let's jump right in. I mean, right from the very first line of the book, Orwell sets this tone of unease and, this kind of creeping dread. It's subtle but powerful. It was a bright, cold day in April, and the clocks were striking 13.
Yeah, that's a great place to start. I mean,
Yeah.
13,
Yeah.
right away, something's off.
Yeah.
Something's not right.
Exactly. And then we're introduced to the telescreen, this device that's constantly watching and listening to every citizen. The instrument, the telescreen it was called, could be dimmed, but there was no way of shutting it off completely. I mean, talk about feeling like you're constantly being watched.
Yeah, it's that sense of inescapable surveillance that really gets under your skin. And I think it's something that a lot of people can relate to today, even if it's not, literal telescreens watching us.
Mm-hmm.
Think about all the data that's collected on us online, our browsing history, our search terms, our social media activity. It's all there. It's all being tracked and analyzed.
I know, it's creepy, right? Like, I catch myself sometimes wondering, who's looking at all this stuff and what are they doing with it? And I think that feeling of being watched, of not being able to truly escape the gaze of, Big Brother, so to speak, it's something that Orwell really captured brilliantly in the book.
Yeah, and it goes beyond just the actual data collection. It's the psychological impact,
Mm.
that feeling that someone's always watching, always listening, that you can't let your guard down even for a moment.
Mm.
That creates a climate of fear and self-censorship where people are afraid to express their true thoughts and feelings even to themselves.
Right. Like, you're always second guessing yourself, thinking, is this okay to think? Is this going to get me in trouble? It's like that old saying, if you've got nothing to hide, you've got nothing to fear. But 1984 shows us that even if you're not doing anything wrong, the very possibility of being watched can change your behavior. It can make you less likely to take risks, to speak out, to challenge authority.
See, exactly. It's about control. Ultimately, that's what the party in 1984 is all about: control. Controlling information, controlling thoughts, controlling behavior. And surveillance is one of their most powerful tools for achieving that control.
Okay, so we've got this atmosphere of constant surveillance, but then there's the actual structure of this society, which is, just as messed up. I mean, you got these three ministries: truth, peace, and love. The names themselves are just so ironic.
Yeah, Orwell was a master of irony and satire. And those ministry names are a perfect example. They're complete inversions of what they actually represent.
So the Ministry of Truth actually deals with propaganda and rewriting history.
Right.
The Ministry of Peace wages war.
Right.
And the Ministry of Love is responsible for torture and brainwashing.
Exactly. It's like they're deliberately trained to warp people's understanding of reality to make them believe that up is down and black is white.
It's mind-boggling. How can people possibly function in a world where truth is so blatantly manipulated? Like, where do you even begin to make sense of things?
Well, that's where doublethink comes in. This is one of Orwell's most brilliant and chilling concepts. It's the ability to hold two contradictory beliefs simultaneously, to believe that war is peace, that freedom is slavery, that ignorance is strength.
It's like some kind of mental gymnastics, right? Like, how can your brain even process that?
Well, in a way, it's a survival mechanism in the world of 1984. If you want to survive, you have to learn to suppress your critical thinking abilities, to accept whatever the party tells you, even if it contradicts your own lived experience.
So you're basically being gaslighted on a societal level.
Yeah, you could say that. It's a form of mass manipulation designed to break down individual thought and create a population that's completely subservient to the party.
That's scary. And that's where our main character, Winston Smith, comes in. He's this seemingly ordinary guy who starts to rebel against the party, and it all begins with a very simple act, writing "Down with Big Brother" in his diary.
Yeah, that moment is so powerful because it's an act of defiance in a world where even thinking the wrong thing can get you vaporized. It's Winston reclaiming his right to think his own thoughts, even if it's just on paper.
Right. And remember, this is a world where the thought police are always watching, always listening, ready to sniff out any hint of unorthodoxy. So Winston's act is incredibly risky. It's like he's knowingly putting a target on his back.
He is. And it shows just how desperate he is to break free from the party's control, to assert his own individuality, to find some kind of truth in a world that's built on lies.
But he doesn't stop there. He also attends the 2 Minutes Hate This daily ritual where everyone screams and yells at images of Emmanuel Goldstein, the supposed enemy of the state. It's like a scene straight out of a nightmare.
It's a brilliant example of how totalitarian regimes use propaganda to control their populations. By creating a common enemy, they unify the people against a perceived threat and distract them from the real problems within their own society.
So it's like a giant pep rally for hate.
Yeah, you could say that. It's a way to channel people's anger and frustration away from the party and toward an external target. It's a classic divide and conquer strategy.
And it's not just adults who are caught up in this frenzy. Orwell describes the Parsons children, these creepy little kids who are members of the junior spies. They play violent games and turn in their own parents to the authorities. It's chilling.
Yeah, that's one of the most disturbing aspects of 1984, the way that the party indoctrinates children from a young age. They're taught to spy on their families, to report any sign of disloyalty. It's like they're being bred to be informants.
It's like they're creating a whole generation of mini thought police.
Exactly. And it shows how totalitarianism seeks to control every aspect of life from the cradle to the grave. There's no escape.
So we've got this world where you're constantly being watched, your thoughts are being policed, your children are being turned against you. It's pretty bleak stuff. But in the midst of all this darkness, Winston finds a glimmer of hope in O'Brien, a high-ranking party member. He becomes convinced that O'Brien might secretly share his doubts about the party.
That yearning for connection, for someone who understands your dissent, is a powerful motivator. It's what keeps Winston going, even when everything seems hopeless.
Remember that moment when Winston and O'Brien exchanged glances during the 2 minutes? Winston reads so much into that brief encounter, believing it confirms his suspicions about O'Brien.
Right. It's like he's clinging to any shred of hope, even if it's just a look, a gesture, a fleeting moment of connection.
And then there's Julia, this rebellious young woman who becomes Winston's lover. They have this forbidden relationship sneaking around in a world where love and intimacy are tightly controlled.
Yeah, their relationship is like a breath of fresh air in this oppressive world. It's a symbol of hope, of resistance, of the enduring human spirit.
Their stolen moments together, the secret messages, the rendezvous in Victory Square, it all feels so dangerous and exciting.
It highlights the importance of human connection, even in the most oppressive environments.
Right.
And it shows that even in the face of tyranny, people will find ways to love, to connect, to experience joy.
Their hideaway above Mr. Charrington's shop becomes a sanctuary for them, a place where they can be themselves, even if it's just for a little while.
It represents a space of freedom and privacy in a world where those things are increasingly scarce.
And that room with its worn furniture, the smell of real coffee, the prole woman singing outside the window, it represents everything the party is trying to destroy: beauty, individuality, human connection.
It's a reminder that even in the darkest of times, there are still glimmers of hope, of humanity, of the things that make life worth living.
And speaking of hope, Winston eventually makes contact with the Brotherhood, this legendary underground resistance movement led by Goldstein. He receives a copy of Goldstein's book, The Theory and Practice of Oligarchical Collectivism. It's like he's finally found a blueprint for rebellion.
Right, and that book is going to be key to understanding the inner workings of Oceania and how the party maintains its grip on power. It's going to challenge everything Winston thought he knew about the world. It really is. And Goldstein's analysis of power is, I think, one of the most thought-provoking parts of the book.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, he talks about these three classes, high, middle, and low, and how they're constantly vying for power.
Right, and he argues that this struggle, this cyclical pattern of one class overthrowing another, it's been going on throughout history.
It's like this never-ending Game of Thrones, basically.
Exactly, and Goldstein doesn't see revolution as a solution.
Yeah.
You know, he believes that it just leads to another cycle of oppression with a different group in charge.
So it's like, no matter who's in power, the system itself is inherently corrupt.
That's a pretty bleak outlook, but I think there's a lot of truth to it. Power corrupts. And absolute power corrupts, absolutely.
And speaking of corrupt systems, Goldstein's book also goes into detail about Newspeak, the party's language designed to limit thought and expression.
Yeah, Newspeak is a fascinating and disturbing concept. It's this idea that by controlling language, you can control thought.
So if you can't even think certain thoughts because the words don't exist, then you can't rebel against the party.
Right. It's like they're shrinking the very space in which independent thought can exist.
It's pretty mind-blowing when you think about it, like how much of our thinking is shaped by the language we use.
Oh, absolutely. And Orwell was way ahead of his time in recognizing the power of language to shape our perceptions of reality.
Okay, so Winston is armed with this newfound knowledge from Goldstein's book. He's part of the Brotherhood. He's got Julia by his side. Things are looking, well, maybe not good, but at least there's a flicker of hope. But then, bam, they get betrayed and arrested in their hideaway.
Yeah, that's a real gut punch moment.
Yeah.
It turns out Mr. Charrington, the kindly old shopkeeper who rented them the room, is a member of the Thought Police. All along, he's been spying on them, reporting their every move to the party.
Talk about a twist ending. It's like Orwell is reminding us that in this world, no one can be trusted, not even the most seemingly harmless characters.
Right, and it highlights the party's absolute ruthlessness. They'll use anyone, anything to maintain their control.
And what follows is even more harrowing. Winston is taken to the Ministry of Love, where he endures months of torture and brainwashing at the hands of none other than O'Brien.
Yeah, that's the ultimate betrayal. The man who Winston believed was a fellow dissident turns out to be his tormentor.
It's heartbreaking to read about the physical and psychological abuse that Winston suffers. The beatings, the electric shocks, the sleep deprivation, the forced confessions.
It's all designed to break him, to make him submit to the party's will.
And then there's Room 101, this legendary chamber where prisoners are confronted with their worst nightmares.
Room 101 is the ultimate symbol of terror in 1984. It's where the party demonstrates its absolute power over the individual.
For Winston, it's rats. His absolute worst fear, O'Brien, threatens to release a cage full of starving rats onto Winston's face, and in a moment of sheer panic, Winston betrays Julia, begging O'Brien to do it to her instead.
It's a horrific scene, and it shows how far the party is willing to go to crush any spark of resistance.
And what's even more disturbing is that Winston is eventually released back into society, but he's a changed man. He's embraced the party's ideology, he loves Big Brother, he's a shell of his former self.
It's the party's ultimate victory. They haven't just broken his body, they've broken his spirit.
It's a chilling reminder of the power of propaganda and brainwashing to reshape a person's entire worldview.
And it makes you wonder, what would it take to break you? To make you betray your own values? To love Big Brother?
I mean, it's like he's become a completely different person.
He has, and that's the truly tragic part of it all. He's lost his humanity.
There's that really chilling scene where he runs into Julia in a park, and they're both just totally indifferent to each other. Like, their love, their rebellion, it's all been erased.
It's like they're just empty shells going through the motions of life.
And what's even more disturbing is that Winston seems genuinely happy in this state of, blissful ignorance. He really believes he loves Big Brother.
It's terrifying, right?
Yeah.
It makes you question the very nature of freedom and happiness.
Yeah, I mean, is ignorance really bliss, or is it just a form of enslavement?
That's the question that Orwell is forcing us to grapple with.
And, it's hard not to draw parallels to our own world. We may not have telescreens in every room, but we are surrounded by screens by a constant stream of information, much of it designed to manipulate and control us.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, think about social media algorithms, targeted advertising, the 24-hour news cycle.
Yeah.
It's all designed to keep us engaged, to keep us consuming, to shape our thoughts and behaviors.
So are we any freer than the citizens of Oceania?
That's a tough question. And I think the answer is it depends. It depends on how aware we are of these forces, how willing we are to question the information we're given, to think critically, to challenge the status quo.
So it's not just about avoiding telescreens. It's about being mindful of the ways in which we're being manipulated and controlled in our own society.
Exactly. It's about recognizing the subtle forms of propaganda that are all around us and developing the critical thinking skills to resist them.
It's like that quote from Goldstein's book. Orthodoxy means not thinking, not needing to think. Orthodoxy is unconsciousness. We have to stay awake. We have to keep thinking for ourselves.
Absolutely. And that's the challenge, isn't it? In a world that's constantly bombarding us with information, it's easy to just tune out, to become passive consumers, to let others do our thinking for us.
So how do we resist that? How do we stay awake? How do we make sure that we're not just sleepwalking into a dystopian future?
Well, I think it starts with education, with understanding how propaganda works, how our minds can be manipulated, how to identify bias and misinformation.
So we need to be more media literate, basically.
Right. And we need to be willing to engage in difficult conversations, to challenge our own beliefs, to listen to perspectives that are different from our own.
Because if we just surround ourselves with people who think the same way we do, we're never going to grow. We're never going to learn.
Exactly. We need to be open to new ideas, to different ways of seeing the world. That's how we avoid becoming trapped in echo chambers of our own making.
So it's not just about individual awareness. It's about building a more informed, a more critical, a more engaged society.
Right. And that's a tall order,
Yeah.
but I think it's worth striving for.
Well, this has been a really eye-opening deep dive, I have to say.
Yeah, it's been great.
Orwell's 1984 is one of those books that just stays with you. It makes you think. It makes you question. It makes you want to fight for a better future.
I agree, and I think that's the ultimate message of the book. It's a warning, but it's also a call to action. It's a reminder that we have the power to choose the kind of world we want to live in.
So to our listeners out there, we leave you with this. What will you do to resist the forces of conformity and to create a world where freedom and truth prevail? Thanks for joining us on this deep dive, and we'll see you next time.